everyone! Today I'm talking all about gauge swatches, how to make them, what to do when you have made them, and how to use them in your knitting and crochet. Let's jump into it. Gauge and gauge swatches is probably one of the questions that I get asked more than any other thing. And so I just wanted to do a little bit of like a deep dive today into the gauge swatch realm. So you will see a huge number of gauge swatches in front of me right here. I will admit this is about every gauge swatch that I've ever made in my life. I am not much of a gauge swatcher, but I will talk about what that means for my knitting and crochet projects, so that you kind of get to make your own decision about there are pros and cons of doing gauge swatches, and I'll talk about all of them, and then you get to pick what is going to work the best for you, for doing them or not doing them, where there are some situations where they may make more sense versus other situations where they may not be that beneficial for you. So the first thing, let's start at the very beginning. What is a gauge swatch? And the answer to that question is a gauge swatch is when you use the yarn that you plan to use for your project and either the knitting needle or the crochet hook size that you plan to use for the project, and you make a little square or rectangle or piece of fabric that puts your yarn and your needle or hook together to create that fabric so you see how big your stitches are. That's what a gauge swatch is. It's combining the yarn you're going to use and the tool that you're going to use to see what the result looks like. Now, to me, in my brain, there are two reasons to do a gauge swatch. The first one of them is what I think most people think about when you talk about doing gauge swatches, and that is to get the correct gauge for whatever your project is. So your pattern says you should get 5 stitches to the inch. You are doing a gauge swatch to see, do I get 5 stitches to the inch? If I don't, what can I do differently so that I do get 5 stitches to the inch, which is what my pattern wants me to. I picked the random number 5 out of the air. It could be whatever number the pattern says. But that is reason number 1 why people do a gauge swatch. To me, that reason is not a reason that I go with all that often. The biggest reason for that is because I tend to do so much of my own pattern design that I'm almost never trying to match a gauge for a pattern. So that's just kind of a non-issue for me. The other reason to do a gauge swatch, in my opinion, the much more important reason to do a gauge swatch, is to see if you like the fabric that you're getting. To see if you like working with that yarn and that needle or hook size. You like the way they feel together. Sometimes if you're working on things where your tools are too large or too small for your yarn, it will just feel awkward. They won't feel like they go together very well. It will feel like you're having to do too much work to make that happen. Or you may decide, okay, they feel fine, I'm working with this fine, but I don't like the way the fabric looks. So you can see this fabric here. This to me is what I want my knitted fabric to look like. It's not super stiff, so it's got some wiggle to it, but it's not like big and open and holy where I can see through it either. This to me is like, this is the fabric I would want for a sweater or a hat or a scarf, something like this. Doing a gauge swatch lets me make sure that I am in fact getting the fabric that I like the way it looks, and I like the way it feels, and I like the way that the needles and the yarn work together to get me that. To me, that is the point of doing a gauge swatch. I am personally much more likely to make changes if I know that I don't care for the fabric in a swatch, versus once I've started the project and I'm kind of looking at the fabric, or I'm kind of continuing to make the stitches and thinking, this isn't exactly what I want. But to me, once I've committed to making the project, it's harder for me to say, no, I'm going to stop, I'm going to rip this out, and I'm going to start again with a different size needle or hook. So doing it in a swatch kind of gives me permission to make those changes easier. There's sort of a mechanism for me to do that more so than if I just jump right into the garment. So to me, those are the two reasons to do a gauge swatch. You're trying to see if you match what the pattern thinks you're supposed to be doing, or you're checking to see, do I like the way this fabric looks? Do I like using these materials together? Do they work well for me? So those are the two situations that I think gauge swatches are useful in. The issue can be sometimes those things don't match. So you may occasionally, and this is probably not going to happen super often, but I did want to mention it because it certainly has happened to me, that you are getting the gauge that the pattern tells you that you're supposed to be. You're working with a worsted weight yarn, you're using a size 7 knitting needle, you're getting 5.5 stitches, to the inch. Everything is doing exactly what it's supposed to, matches the pattern, matches the ball band for your yarn. Everything is perfect, but you look at that fabric and you think, I don't like the way this looks. I don't like the way this feels. I don't like doing this. Then you may be looking at, maybe that yarn is not a good fit. Maybe that yarn is a thin worsted or a thick worsted or something like that. Or that yarn may just not be a good fit for that pattern. And so those are kind of bigger questions that you have to ask yourself if those two things don't work together. If you got the gauge the pattern once, but you don't like the fabric, don't ignore that. That's useful information that you got from doing the work of the gauge swatch. Don't just say, oh, I'm sure it will be fine. Do something with that. But just be aware that that can happen. Just because the pattern says that's what the stitches are supposed to look like doesn't mean you have to love it if you don't care for it. So I did want to give a couple of examples of how different patterns can use different gauges on purpose because they're trying to achieve a different effect. So these two pieces were both done with a fingering weight or a sock yarn. They're both a wool blend, like a wool nylon, basically a sock blend. But I did them on very different size needles because I wanted a very different effect. So this is actually our custom dyed yarn by Buy Yarns that matches our yarn truck art. So this is their colorway that they did just for us called Yarn Truck at the End of the Rainbow. And I am working on a shawl with this. And I can definitely see it, and I think I can see it showing up on screen as well. You can see through this fabric. So I can easily see the screen through here as I'm holding it up in front of my face. I can see the light from the screen. I can see the lights from the office here. I can even see, I can see color, and I can see the outline of myself through here. This is a very drapey fabric. It's super swishy and whooshy, and this is because it's going to be a shawl that wraps around, and you want it to lay and drape really nicely. And you want it to be warm, but you don't want it to be stiff. You want it to sort of wrap and drape really nicely. This is done on a US size 5 needle, which is huge for a sock yarn. You would never knit socks with sock yarn on a size 5 needle. This is done intentionally with a really loose gauge to get that nice drapey effect and that nice sort of diaphanous look to it. This hat, on the other hand, there is no seeing through this. I can't even really see light. I definitely can't see the outline of myself through this on the screen. This is a cabley hat. This is also done with the sock yarn. This is one that my mom gifted to me like a decade ago. I love this hat. I wear it all the time. This was done on a size 3 needle. Still a little loose for socks. I normally do my socks on a 0 or a 1, but this being 2 needle size smaller, you can see it stands up a little bit on its own. It's not so drapey and flowy, it's stiffer. It's not as see-through, it's not as flowy, and that's because it's doing a different thing. You want it to have a little bit of structure. I'm not putting a wool hat on, it's 1,000,000 degrees outside and I've been working in the garden all day. I'm sweaty. But you want this to have a little bit of stiffness to retain its nice hat shape, and you want it to be really warm to keep that warmth in for the warm winter piece. So this is done with a very different gauge on purpose because you want want a different thing. So it's not at all that there is a right gauge and a wrong gauge for a certain type of thickness of yarn. It's very specific to the project that you're doing, how you plan to use it, the yarn that you're using, the climate that you live in, your personal preferences. Things that are knit at a very tight gauge are going to wear better. So I have worn this hat for 5 years and it's held up very, very well. If I was doing it with a loose gauge like this, these are going to be softer feeling. They work really well for things up around your neck and for that drape, but they're not going to wear as well. It's okay. I'm probably not going to like wrap this around my feet and try to walk on it. So it doesn't need to hold up to that much wear and tear. And so I like the benefits of that looser gauge. So tight gauge, it's going to feel stiffer, it's going to look stiffer, it's going to wear better. Loose gauge, it's going to feel softer, it's going to be drapier, but it's not going to wear as well. And there are times and places for all of those things. So that's why knitting and crocheting can be a lot of fun, because you can really customize all of that. So those are kind of some of the whys behind the gauge. Like, what is the purpose of doing this? Why are we doing it? Why would some patterns call for a different gauge than other patterns would call for? That's kind of a little bit of behind the scenes for that. Now I want to get into the nitty-gritty of how do we measure the gauge. The making of the gauge square is very straightforward. You work the exact same way, whether it's this one's crocheted, this one's knitted. You are going to create a square that's big enough to be useful. Don't make a 1-inch square. That's probably a little bit too small. A 2-inch square, probably okay. A 3 or 4-inch square, the larger the square, the more accurate your information is going to be that you're getting from it, but the longer it's going to take, the more yarn it's going to use. So you want to get that balance of not so tiny that you can't get any information from it, but not so big that you're just not going to bother to do it because it's going to take too long. So these tend to be about what I like. I like 2 to 3-inch squares. I don't generally do a 4-inch gauge swatch. I know myself and I wouldn't finish that. So you're going to want to either chain or cast on enough stitches that you're going to have between 2 and 4 inches. I think anywhere in there is going to work fine for you. And then you are going to work in the pattern that you plan to make your project in. So this sample is done in double crochet. If my pattern that I'm following is for a scarf that is done all in double crochet, this is perfect. If the project that I have in my mind, and I'm not following a pattern, I'm just making it up as I go along, but I plan to do it mostly in double crochet, this is perfect. If the pattern that I'm following or the pattern that I'm making up is done in single crochet, this gauge swatch is useless. It doesn't give me it doesn't give me nearly as much information as it could if I was doing the stitch that I'm doing my project in. This gets a little bit more complicated if you're doing a project that has multiple different stitches in it. My basic rule would be if the pattern, most patterns will tell you, it will say 5.5 stitches per inch in stockinette stitch, 5.5 stitches per inch in single crochet, whatever it is. Most patterns will tell you. If they don't tell you, it's almost always double crochet for crocheting and stockinette stitch for knitting. Stockinette stitch, if you're working flat, is you knit one whole row and purl the other row coming back again. If you are not sure exactly what pattern you plan to be using, make that decision before you make a gauge swatch. Gauge swatches are also great ways to practice patterns that you've never done before. So if you want to make a scarf that uses the alligator stitch with crochet, but you've never done it, make a little practice 4-inch square with that. You'll learn how to do it. You're like weird wonky because you're just learning and figuring out how this works. That'll all be on a square instead of on the scarf that you're going to wear around your neck. So I think using the swatches as a chance to practice your stitches gives you another added benefit to doing your gauge swatches. And then I would highly recommend make them, again, at least 2 inches. So I would do at least 2 inches wide, at least 2 inches long. If 2 inches is all you've got in you, fine, 2 inches is great. 3 or 4 may give you a little bit more accurate idea. But as long as it's at least 2 inches square, that's fine. Then you are going to want to finish these off. So take them all the way off, bind off, cast off, whatever you're doing, so that they're not attached to your needles or your hook or your ball of yarn anymore. The reason for that is if you need a really accurate gauge swatch to make sure, is this really the number that the pattern thinks it's supposed to be, or for if you're evaluating, do I like the way this fabric looks? You need to block your swatch. Blocking just means get it wet and let it dry. I would advise you, if you are not going to block your swatch before you measure it and make decisions about your patterns, just don't make a swatch, because it really can make that much difference. If you're going to go to the effort of making it, block it. And the conventional wisdom is wash it in whatever way you will wash that garment. So if you're going to machine wash your sweater, machine wash your swatch. If you're going to hand wash your sweater, hand wash your swatch. For me personally, if I don't happen to have a load of laundry going, I will just put it in a sink full of hot water, like as hot as it comes out of the tap, with a squirt of whatever soap is right next to whatever sink I happen to be using, and then like swish it really aggressively with my hands. The hot water, the soap, lots of agitation. That's going to be about as much agitation as a washing machine would give it, and that's going to be about as much as I would ever do with hand washing. So for me personally, that's close enough, but you can get even more accurate with that if you really want to, and machine wash it or hand wash it and use the detergent you're going to use. You can go the whole thing. To me, it needs to get wet. And in my personal opinion, swatches do all of the changes that they are going to do. They do those all when they're wet, and so you don't have to wait for your swatch to dry. You can get it wet, swish it around, rinse it, do the whole thing, wring it out, lay it flat. Don't like stretch and pull and pin to within an inch of its life kind of a thing, but just kind of let it lay however it's naturally going to lay. And at that point, to me, the swatch changes when it gets wet. It doesn't change as it dries. It doesn't like shrink up as it dries. And so to me, you can then measure your swatch at that point after it's wet. But swatches tend to change so much when they get wet for the very first time that if you're not going to do that part, just skip the swatch. If your project it doesn't matter that much that it can be off by as much as that could change, you probably don't need to do a swatch at all. So that's how to make your swatch, how to prep your swatch. Now we're going to do how to measure your swatch. You've done all of that work. You want to make sure that you're taking accurate measurements. What I do not recommend doing is saying, okay, there's 20 stitches across here. I'm going to take my ruler or measuring tape, anything like that works just fine, and I'm going to measure the whole thing. So there's 20 stitches across. My piece measures 5.5 inches, so I'm just going to say 5.5 inches divided by 20 stitches. How many stitches per inch is that? That's not going to give you a super accurate answer. You can do that to get an estimate, but your edge stitches of a swatch are always going to be warped a little bit. This swatch with your knitting, a lot of people when they're doing swatches, and I certainly did this, is you do a non-curling edge around the outside so that your swatch doesn't curl up into a tiny little tube. But that's a different gauge than the stockinette stitch in the middle. Even if you didn't do that, the stitches right at the edge just tend to warp a little bit as there aren't stitches beside them holding them even. So when you're measuring your gauge, you want to measure smack dab in the middle of your piece. So you're going to take your ruler or your tape measure, or this is a little gauge swatcher, so this is a 2-inch section, and you can plop this right on the top of your fabric, and then it kind of blocks off. You're just counting what is from here to here. So that can be, if your eyes go a little bit crossed as you're trying to count things, having something like this where it blocks it off can be super useful. But I very often just use a tape measure. As long as it's something that accurately tells you what 1 inch is, it's going to work fine for you. And you are just going to count how many stitches are in that 1-inch section. So you're going to go from 1 inch to 2 inch on your measuring device of choice, and you're going to count. For knitting, I think knit stitches look like the letter V all stacked up next to each other. You're just going to count those letter V's. Now the thing about the letter V's that are all next to each other is here's 1 and here's 2. Well, here is a third V that opens down. It's like an upside down V. Pick one. Either pick all the V's that point up, like a right side up letter V, or pick all the V's that are upside down letter V's. Do not count both. So this is 2 stitches. This is not 3 stitches. So when you're counting, you're just going to count how many letter V's are all the way across in that 1-inch section. If you're doing crochets, especially taller stitches in crochets, these are very easy because crochet stitches are always only connected at the top and the bottom. And so you can see, I like my little thumb will come out through these. It's almost like there's a pole sticking up. These are called the post of your crochet stitches, but they're very easy to count. So you're counting how many posts of your stitches are within that 1-inch or 2-inch section. The longer the area that you count in, so if you count how many stitches are in 1 inch, and then you count how many stitches are in 2 inches, and then you count how many stitches are in 3 inches, the one where you count how many stitches are in 3 inches is going to be the most accurate because you're getting like over a wider area. So you're getting a more accurate picture. If you've got to pick, is that half a stitch or a quarter of a stitch? Just the longer the area that you are counting your gauge over, the more accurate that is going to be. So that's where doing a slightly larger swatch is going to give you a little bit more accurate information. I would always, always, always recommend count your swatch, write down on a piece of paper with a pen, write down what you measured and what the answer was. So write down 5 stitches in 1 inch. 10 stitches in 2 inches, whatever the actual thing that you measured was. You're probably going to want to know, your pattern is probably going to give you the gauge in 1 inch. But if you measure it in 3 inches, write it down in 3 inches, say 15 stitches in 3 inches. And then, after you've finished with your gauge swatch, you can go and do the math to convert it into what the pattern wants. Trying to do it in your head while you're also trying to count and pay attention to like your kid trying to bite the cat in the other room, your brain can do wacky things. If you write the math, that you've done the math, you counted it in 3 inches, you got 15 stitches, and in your head you were trying to do the math. 15 divided by 3. That's not hard math, right? I guarantee you I would mess that up. That's just how my brain is functioning right now. And I would write down 7, who knows? If you write down 7 stitches in 1 inch and you did the math wrong, there's no way to ever catch that problem because you didn't write down the intermediate steps. So if you're going to measure it in 3 inches, write it down, 15 stitches in 3 inches, and then go and do the math later. I would also always recommend do your measurement, write it down, pick your measuring thing up, measure in a completely different part of your, move your measuring thing over a half an inch over and a half an inch down, and count again. See if your 2 numbers are the same. If they are, great, you did it right. If they're not, let's try this a 3rd time. See if we can get 2 of the same answers right in a row. That's another way of double checking yourself. All of this may seem a little bit silly, but if you're going to go to all the time of making the swatch and blocking the swatch and measuring the swatch and doing the math, you might as well count it twice. That part's going to take you 10 seconds compared to how long it took you to do the rest of the project. So that is how you kind of get to the mathy part of things to see what your swatch is. If you, like me, find that actually the most useful part of this to say, why am I even doing the swatch? To me, the most useful part is saying, how do I like the way this fabric moves and feels and all of that jazz? The thing to do with that, you probably are going to need to wait for your swatch to dry, but you want to play with it a little bit. I talk with my hands, and so I am playing with this a whole lot, but kind of do the same thing, like stretch it and pull it and look through it and look at the light and hold it against your skin. If it's going to be a sweater, like hold it against your undergarment strap if that showing through your fabric is something that's going to bother you. Play with it a little bit and think, okay, do I like this? Is it too stiff? Is it too floppy? Is it too see-through? Is it whatever? And really spend just a couple of minutes playing with it to think, okay, is this really what I want? Am I going to be happy with this? To make sure that you're using the information from the swatch to say, okay, I really do like this fabric to create my sweater or my scarf or whatever it is that you're going to make from it. I like this combination.